how's it going? This is Joe Intel, and today we're going to talk about preference versus reference in audio. So the source of this question is from the Daily Hi-Fi Crew. We were talking about my upcoming review of some Arendal speakers, and I was talking about how they sound versus what I did to what I think improved the sound with Magic Beans, an app that I'm coming out with in the near future. And so the topic came up, reference versus preference. Shout out to Michael Squires for coming up with that awesome name. So the first thing we want to know is what exactly is reference when it comes to audio. And reference to me is an objective, just a benchmark, something that we can aim towards and something that we can measure. So let's say for a speaker, the reference for the frequency response, in my opinion, should be a flat or neutral response, meaning that what comes in, the signal that goes in, is what comes out the other end. And so you have an accurate reproduction of the sound. On a graph, what that would show is something that is linear, not something that goes up and down. Also, something that has a wide frequency range that covers from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz, the range of human hearing. Now, you may also hear people talk about reference volume, and typically what that means is that for a theater, that would be 85 decibels with peaks up to 105 dB. In a home, it's usually a little bit lower just because people don't like to listen that loud. So somewhere around 79 dB to about 99 dB for the peaks for the subwoofer and LFE frequencies. So that's a reference level that people can aim for to make sure that their speakers can play that loud without distortion. So the next logical question would be, what is preference? And to me, preference is just the subjective aspect of listening. And so if reference is 85 or 79 dB, that might not be how loud you want to listen. Maybe you like to listen a little bit lower, or you may like to listen a little bit louder. That's your personal preference. For frequency response, some people like a little bit of a boosted treble response because that makes it sound more clear, and you may hear stuff in music that you've never heard before, some extra detail, things like that. The downside is that may sound fatiguing after long extended periods of time. Some people like a 2 kilohertz dip, and that's usually where the crossover is between the mid-range and the tweeter. And so if the crossover isn't great, that can kind of, hide some of the issues there in directivity. But also, because 2 kilohertz is a frequency that we can use to localize, it helps speakers disappear. So it's hard to localize where the sound is coming from, and some people like that effect. The downside is you might lose some attack in that 2 kilohertz region where things just don't sound as forward. Now, one big one is that a lot of people like extra bass. You hear it in people with their sound systems in their cars, with the trunk rattling. People just like bass. And even people with home theater systems, they tend to crank up the bass maybe a little bit higher than they need to. But, that's just something that's enjoyable for a lot of people. Dr. Floyd Toole has said it himself to me on the phone that too much bass is the forgivable sin in audio. I tend to agree with that statement. The truth is that they can support one another. It doesn't have to always be that it's either reference or preference. They can work together. And by that, I mean that reference is just the baseline. It's the thing that we can all agree upon, whether something's hitting a certain decibel, whether a speaker has a frequency response that is linear or not. It's just the baseline. It's something that we can agree upon as a metric. So we have to consider that there are people who are mixing and mastering the audio that we're consuming. So whether it be music or movies, somebody's there making it, and they're making decisions as to how much treble, how much bass, how much mid-range, how much 2K to add or remove. And so they're making these artistic decisions. Now, hopefully they're using a system that is referenced, that is flat, and their dB is set properly. Hopefully, fingers crossed. So in my opinion, it is up to them to make these artistic decisions. So the playback system is supposed to be high fidelity. That's what hi-fi is all about, meaning a high quality reproduction of the source. And so an accurate reproduction to me is hi-fi. Now, that doesn't guarantee that you're gonna like the decisions that they made. Maybe they added too much bass, or maybe not enough bass, or too much treble, and you're gonna wanna go and adjust that. I think that you should be able to do that on the fly. So at the end of the day, you have to enjoy the content. Whether they mix it a certain way or not, you're the one who has to listen to it. Now, some people might argue that if you like a certain sound, that you should get speakers or tune your system to have that sound all the time. The problem is you don't know whether the creator has already added that response. So let's say, for example, you like a V-shaped response. Lots of treble, lots of bass. That's just what you like. Well, what if the creator also liked that response and they built it into the sound. So now instead of a V-shaped response like this, you have an extreme V-shaped response. The problem is that you don't know how it's mixed. So in my opinion, it's better to have a system that is a reference, that you know is playing something back accurately, and you can make adjustments on the fly. Most AVRs have a bass and treble tone control. I would prefer it to be one knob where you can adjust the tilt and add more bass and treble just quickly using a single knob. I hope somebody implements that in the future. But for now, you can adjust the bass and treble on a per track basis if that's something that you're into. For me, I tend to just keep it on neutral. And if something's a bad recording, well, that's just what it is. I accept it and I can still enjoy the sound. Another argument that I hear is that everybody hears differently. And that's true. We all have different ears. If you're older, you may have some high frequency hearing loss. But the reason why I still stick to the idea that reference is a good standard, because let's just say, for example, somebody's, playing a violin, right? Somebody with high frequency hearing loss is going to hear that violin live in the room with a little bit less treble. But that becomes their reference point. The reference is how sounds are in the real world to that person. So if you play back that sound over a stereo system, it will also have high frequency hearing loss because the person has high frequency hearing loss. The speaker itself shouldn't act as a hearing aid. I think if it did and they added treble to make it sound perfect to an average person with average hearing, they might think, actually, that sounds a little bit bright, right? So that's how psychoacoustics works. It's not just about acoustics, it's also about how we interpret the sounds. So having said all that, I do think that reference is a worthy goal, especially because what I do is I review speakers and audio equipment. And a lot of times you'll see us do more objective measurements. And some people find that boring. They think, just listen with your ears and trust your ears and, everything is subjective. And I don't disagree with all of that. I'm only here to say that the objective part, reference, is useful. It's a place that we can all look and say, is it able to produce a flat frequency response? Is it able to get to reference levels? There's a standard, so we can't just say everything is great. It's either it hits these targets or it doesn't. I also want to mention that with the use of DSP, digital signal processing, there are ways to make a speaker perform more like an ideal, perfectly linear speaker. The thing that you can't change is the directivity and some of the physical properties. So if when you turn it off axis, the sound starts to sound real funky, well, that's a physical property. That's because of the way the speaker is shaped and things like that. You can't really change that with signal processing. But a speaker that is well designed will take well to DSP and EQ, and that's what I'm interested in when I'm reviewing a speaker. Of course, it would be great if the speaker came out of the box perfectly linear and just everything perfect. A lot of times that's not the case. Sometimes it just needs a little bit of help with some signal processing, and you can get it to sound a lot better than it came passively out of the box. And so that's what I'm interested in right now. DSP to me is one of the best things that has ever happened to audio. The important thing to look for right now when buying a speaker is not just how it sounds out of the box. I think what's important is how malleable is it? Is it able to take well to EQ? How much latitude does it have for you to boost the bass? Right? So let's say you have a preference. You just like more bass. That's just how you like music. Can it take the extra EQ that you will throw at it? Right? Will the treble handle any more if you wanted to boost that and make stuff sound more clear? If you like listening at a loud volume, can the speaker handle all the EQ that you've done and play at reference level in your particular room? These are all things that you should consider when you're buying any type of audio product. So yes, I think that reference is a worthy goal. I think that preference is also important. And there you have it. Reference versus preference. I think you need a little bit of both. What do you guys think? Leave them in the comments below. So if you're interested in nerding out with me on these topics about audio, make sure to check out my other video regarding directivity and how I use light to describe how it works.